I think a lot of people who might be watching this are wondering if we're only talking about this in order to insult Donald Trump and his followers by making this comparison to periods of our history or periods of South Africa's history that were so much more brutal and violent than America today.
I don't think so. I don't think that's the purpose. I think what's interesting to me is that we essentially have two frontier states, if you think about going back to the 19th century. I have a good example from Bobby Kennedy, and I used this actually in a novel that I wrote called The Persistence of Memory, about trying to understand history and memory in 3 decades of South African life. Kennedy made the following statement: "I came here because of my deep interest and affection for land settled by the Dutch in the mid-17th century, then taken over by the British and at last independent, a land in which the native inhabitants were at first subdued, but relations with whom remain a problem to this day. A land which defined itself on a hostile frontier, a land which has tamed rich natural resources through the energetic application of modern technology, a land which once imported slaves and now must struggle to wipe out the last traces of that former bondage." I refer, of course, to the United States of America. So he made this speech at the University of Cape Town. Actually, it was in 1966. And I think the parallel is actually very clear. What's interesting in looking at issues of race in South Africa versus America is because of the population differential. Certain issues are writ very large in South Africa.
So you wrote in your piece that what precipitated some of the change and some of the chaos in South Africa was economic, forget what the term is, but in the United States, there's this wallet, grab your wallet.
Right, and there's a talk about boycotts, with a way of saying, who do you buy from, who do you not buy from? And that was done very effectively by the liberation political movements in South Africa. Sometimes through intimidation, too. There was a fair amount of decisions to have complete boycotts, and people were beaten up or attacked if they actually broke the boycott. One of the things that I saw in talking to some of the advertisers is political change in South Africa was shown in advertising much before it actually happened. And so there were ads in the mid-1980s that showed black and white couples, mixed-race couples, which at a time it was still legal. There were ads showing all kinds of engagement between people of different races. And part of it is that the advertisers and the businesses realized that their real interest was in encouraging black customers to buy from them.
When you talk about both, that reminds me of the Republican autopsy report from 2012. Are you familiar?
No, not familiar with that.
So after Romney had been defeated, many leading Republicans said, we can no longer win elections by implicitly at times saying we are the party of white America, we need to become more inclusive. And most people assume that that was true, and I think many of the candidates who ran against Donald Trump had embraced that. But there was another strain of thought, and that was, no, there's still opportunity in being the party of white America, as long as we can create enough conflict, division, fear, anxiety, and hatred so that that's the main focus of the majority of voters.
Right. Now, there was a resurgence of a similar party in South Africa, a breakoff from the dominant Afrikaner party, the National Party, and it was called the Herstichte Nasionale Party, the HNP, and they actually called themselves the Verkramptes, which meant constipated ones, and the slightly more liberal, which really wasn't that liberal, National Party members were known as the Verlichtes, the enlightened ones. And they presented a view that gradual change is better and separation of races is a better thing.
Well, I certainly experienced that when I talked to the alt-right, sort of the white supremacist leaders and spokespersons. They used to be assured that they wouldn't have to compete on a level playing field for jobs, for economic opportunity, a place in a college. And then you have things come along like affirmative action, or Black Lives Matter has upset a lot of them. And so there is some of that change is happening too fast. And then there's some of them thinking, well, maybe we can go back to the way it was again. And so there was this Terry Blanche.
Oh, Eugene Terry Blanche.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, who was He went back to trying to go back to the old Voortrekker days when people, the Afrikaners, got into ox wagons and left Cape Town to get away from British rule. And he liked to ride around on a horse. He actually fell off his horse once, which caused a lot of amusement. There was a tape where a British film company interviewed him, and at a certain point he suddenly realized it wasn't a friendly interview, and he started threatening and attacking the reporters, and you see this guy sort of foaming at the mouth, yelling and waving his fist as the reporters back off with the cameras, and everyone thought, well, this is actually very funny. He also got caught up in a sex scandal despite his sort of running on the Christian family values ticket. But he still had a lot of supporters, and one thing I see with the alt-right that is similar is this kind of discussion of saying, actually, we just want something that's fair, which is we want our own separate place, we want our own separate privilege, we want they don't use the word privilege, but our own separate things. And there was a movement, again in the 1980s in South Africa, to create a separate white republic.
I mean, maybe you can explain better than someone who's always been an American like me. What's wrong with wanting to have a white affinity group the same way that African Americans and Asian Americans and Native Americans have heritage or pride organizations? Why shouldn't white Americans have that?
There's no reason white Americans should not have pride in who they are and who their families are, but I think what happens is it's a lack of empathy that comes out of fear, and it comes out largely from not knowing other people and only knowing one small group of people. Mm-hmm. In the South African context, the government was very careful to separate the real lives of black South Africans from white South Africans, and many of the white South Africans who became more radicalized in the 1980s only became that way when they went as members of the army into the townships.
Right, so it was a whites-only army.
There was a whites-only army,
right.
And because there were demonstrations and riots in the townships, the government started sending the army that was supposed to be defending the country against external enemies into attacking and suppressing their own population. And for many white South Africans, the first time they ever saw what life was like in a black township was when they went in a tank, in a armored vehicle, and all of a sudden they see that the stories they were being told about these nice separate houses and everybody's happy turned out not to be true.
So once they did have exposure to the other side of the race line, what happened?
Well, some of them started either changing and becoming actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Some of them wound up simply refusing to serve in the army.
You know, the parallel to America that I'm most keenly aware of goes back to the Old South, the Jim Crow South. Yeah. At the beginning of that period, they were facing a similar population disadvantage in many of those states that had been slave states. There were so many more African-American men than there were white men. So they used these two tactics, state-sponsored terrorism, many murders, many, but also segregation. They installed these rules that sound so familiar when you're talking about South Africa. And obviously there are vestiges of the terror that we're dealing with still today. Right. But in terms of the segregation, we are beginning to break that down. And what I'm finding is that the old Confederate narrative of grievances, about intrusion of the federal government, or just white racial resentment, doesn't play in the cities anymore. It doesn't play among young people anymore. The only places that it plays are in rural areas where white Americans don't have the opportunity to encounter someone who's different.
It certainly suits some politicians' desire to be reelected, and that's one reason I think we see gerrymandering happening in a way that does create, even if the boundaries are actually breaking down, but it does create artificial boundaries.
Right, the gerrymandering tries to maximize the influence of those people not living in diverse communities.
And I think the other thing that starts to change and starts to be realized is actually, as society is shifting, then people don't necessarily vote as a bloc. And that's taken a while to happen in South Africa. Initially, everybody voted for the ANC if they were black South Africans. Today that's shifting and that's changing because it's been, since 1994, there's been an ANC government, and people are starting to realize, well, they don't always have my interest in mind.
This brings me to the thing that I think maybe you could be most helpful to our audience. A younger audience, a more diverse audience. It's the America that we are becoming. But if we don't find a way to reach out to the America that we were and still wants to remain, we're going to have to wait longer for what you say is an inevitable change. And so how can we deal with the fact that there is this grotesquely violent history that makes it hard to even, I just interviewed someone yesterday, and that sort of came up, and it was a Native American woman talking about the pipeline in North Dakota. And I imagined a white audience listening to her and thinking, oh gosh, they're just going to tune her out because they're going to feel like she's trying to shame them. So how do we bridge this divide in a way that convinces more Americans, whatever their race, to say, there's a common good here that we should be striving for, and it isn't us versus them?
I think a lot of the work needs actually to be done by white people. And that's a little harder to convince people who fear being shamed or who fear being made to feel guilty, and shame is a very powerful emotion. But I think it's also understanding that an awareness of that history means you can change it. You can't change what happened in the past, but you can change how you live in the future. And that therefore it doesn't have to mean a feeling of always being blamed, always feeling shame. What happened, I can't do anything about, except to acknowledge it. I think what has always been remarkable has been the power of forgiveness that people have who have suffered. And I think South Africa went through that with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a flawed process, but it actually meant that the history got spoken about, the violence got spoken about, and no one could ever deny it again. That led to a certain amount of upset and a feeling, well, I didn't do that. I wasn't one of those people assassinating activists. But after a while, I think, to realizing that you can acknowledge these things and both sides can then start to move forward.
I mean, truth and reconciliation is a term that we associate with other countries. But do you think America could benefit from truth and reconciliation?
I think it certainly could. I think we are finally starting to see more acknowledgement. The fact that we now have a Museum of African American History in D.C., and it took so long for that to happen. One of the strange parallels is that the first museum in this country devoted solely to slavery, I think, was opened only 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. The Museum of Apartheid came out 8 years after apartheid ended. It's taken a very long time for white America to acknowledge the history of slavery, the damage that's done. You're more likely to hear about that in the South than you might in the North, and yet in a city like Boston or in much of New England, the wealth that built up these cities came from the slave trade, came from the sugar industry. And these things are being talked about in high schools, being talked about in universities, and it makes some people very uncomfortable. But acknowledging them, starting to understand what that history has meant and what that's done to particular populations, to people of color, I think is, again, it's the start, it's the beginning of a very different kind of dynamic.
You know, in talking to some of these alt-right white nationalists, and Trump supporters, frankly, some of them, I realized that there's a very powerful narrative pushing the other way. Essentially what they're saying is there's a war against us, we white people. And all of this stuff, these museums, these Black History Months, this multiculturalism, this diversity, it's all part of the war.
The problem is that when people retrench into not wanting to know what is going on and thinking if we just close our eyes to this, it will go away, we won't have problems anymore. Like when I've heard more right-wing friends say, well, Obama was racially divisive. And the point is that I think racial division started being perhaps more openly talked about when Obama was president, and he got blamed for it, rather than realizing the discussion is coming out of the fact that America has a black president, and there's also a lot of reaction to that on the part of maybe more entrenched and conservative white Americans. I think one of the things that we might learn from what happened in South Africa was the gradual awareness that white South Africans have of the incredible cost to themselves of administering a racist system, the cost to themselves as human beings, as moral human beings, and even starting more and more economically, and that there's a price to be paid for oppressing other people. You can't do it without oppressing yourself. The best example was going to Robben Island with my son when I think he might have been 11 years old, and the island itself is rather beautiful, but the prison is really ugly. And he asked one of the persons showing us around, is like, so the guards actually lived here on the island. It's like, he said, well, why would you want it to be ugly if you live here? And I think what happens is that when we're ugly to other people, we become ugly ourselves. And that would be, I think, the strongest argument is what you do something bad to yourself when you oppress other people.